Dr. John Chuchiak is a specialist on colonial Latin American history with a research emphasis on the history of Mexico and Maya ethnohistory. He teaches a variety of history courses ranging from the introductory courses on Western and world civilizations, upper-level undergraduate courses on Latin American civilization and pre-Columbian cultures, and graduate courses on the history of Mexico, Mesoamerican ethnohistory, and the history of Inquisition in Spain and the New World. His general research focuses on the history of the colonial church in Mexico with a special emphasis on the Franciscan missions, the Inquisition, and the Catholic Church in colonial Yucatan. His most recent publications have examined the contact and colonial transformation of the indigenous cultures of Mexico, most notably the Maya of the Yucatan. He is especially interested in researching the realms of Christian mission history, religion, ethnic conflict, gender, and social change in the wider Atlantic world.
Thank you all. Thank you for coming. Let's, as a historian, we're going to start with the story. Let's go back to 1596. It's February. And the 22-year-old Mariana Núñez de Carvajal suffered a complete and nervous breakdown during her ordeal and participation in an Inquisition trial. The young woman's forced presence at an auto de fe in La Ciudad de Mexico, Mexico City, led her to precarious mental state. Declared by the inquisitors as too mentally unstable to stand trial at the time, she still found herself forced to bear witness to the burning at the stake of her mother, her brother, and her sisters. On December 4th, 1600, Mariana Núñez de Carvajal encountered the recently arrived Inquisitor Don Alonso de Peralta y Robles. She's up for trial a second time on crypto-Judaism. This time, along with Antonio de Caspes. Due to her fragile state of mind and her gender, she was placed, really violating the procedure, in the home of Doña María de Peralta, the older sister of the Inquisitor, the senior Inquisitor of the tribunal, and the mother of Bernardo Vasquez de Tapia, familiar of the Holy Office. The Mexican Inquisitors who had spared her life in 1596 waited this time with patience for her to recover from her precariously unstable state of mind, arrested as a relapsing heretic, a recidivist repeat offender of the crime of Judaizing. As a repeat offender, only one possible outcome awaited her, and that was a penalty of death. In the tragedy that became her second inquisitorial trial before the Mexican tribunal, the young woman, out of desperation or perhaps feigned or legitimate contrition, made a full confession and went on to denounce many other people, including her relatives. Whether still plagued by the mental state that she had suffered in 1596, or out of hope for a reprieve, she claimed to have made a full conversion to Catholicism. As proof, she offered testimony against many of her own friends and relatives. She testified against her younger sister, Ana de León, against her niece, Eleanor, both of whom had been arrested earlier and now would join her in the secret prisons. All three women were brought up to the prisons in the spring of 1600, emotionally, physically drained, and spiritually devastated by the traumatic events of having been forced to participate as spectators in the macabre deaths of their own family. Mariana did not escape the scrutiny of the Holy Office for long. And I'm going to take you on a journey to understand what exactly the Mexican Inquisition was, how it functioned, and everything you always want to know about the Inquisition. Mariana herself would succumb to the flames. According to the confessor who walked alongside her, quote, she died well in the spirit of Christ. Her forced disavowal of her Jewish beliefs and customs, the role that early modern religious intolerance played in the long and tortuous path that led her through the Quemadero and the Plaza de Alameda, Mexico, are going to be discussion of this. Now, she was remarked to say in her second trial, begging after she had been tormented to the inquisitors, which is better, she challenged Alonso de Peralta, to believe and say you do not believe, or not to believe and say you believe. There were philosophical discussions between her and her trial transcripts and the inquisitors. In the end, she truly fervently, apparently believed in a Christian conversion experience. Water and fire. Two important elements. It is through water that one becomes under the control of the Catholic Church. Through baptism, it is a ritual cleansing, but it is also a legal document. The waters of baptism bring you into the legal jurisdiction of the Holy Office. Waters, whether they were received willingly or by forces, is not actually all that important for the legal distinction. It brought the baptized person under the jurisdiction of the Holy Office. As we heard, the Holy Office cannot touch anyone who is not baptized, regardless of what the religion is. Fire. Cleansing also, but in another terrible way. Relaxation. Relajamiento. Ser relajado. To the secular arm, mean death by fire. These two elements will be intimately connected in the lives of people of converso origin, or the so-called crypto-Jews of New Spain. Water and fire. The two important elements that will have brought people in and taking people out, who betrayed the covenant that the water brought you into. So this is the fate of many of New Spain's crypto-Jewish communities. It all begins with what we were just talking about, the expulsion of the Jews in Spain. Eventually their expulsion, conversion, massively, forcibly, and their outright choices to escape, to flee, to pursue their own lifestyle, regardless of what actual beliefs or cultural practices were in other places. Only a few Jewish individuals who left Spain went to Iberian territories, many to Portugal, where they had cultural affinity. After 1580, as we just heard from Gretchen, when the Portuguese Inquisition intensified, many Iberian crypto-Jews began migrating westward. As we saw, Brazil was a place of haven for a short period. We need to understand that some Jews gave in to pressures to convert to Catholicism, but others maintained an identity. The differences between those two interpretations have split the literature in the field. We have scholars like Netanyahu who basically wrote a huge tome to say they're not Jews at all. Others believe that they were. As scholars have shown throughout the last 100 years, since they were unable to access normative Jewish practices and were often cut off from rabbis, that all-important connection to law and cultural practices. Jewish communities, religious objects, prayer books, copies of the Torah, I'll use these prayer books. All of these meant that they had to find indigenous and ingenious ways of maintaining some practice of the cultural, ethnic origins that they had. Now, unlike the Portuguese realm, the Spanish administration in its colonial world, as early as 1528, prohibited the settlement in Mexico, specifically in the Caribbean, of potential agents of religious heresy. Not just conversos who might have Jewish beliefs, but also people who held the newfound Protestant understandings of religion. New Christians and descendants of convicts of Spanish or Portuguese Inquisition tribunals for the fourth generation were barred entry. But a thriving market in fake documents allowed many people to arrive in the New World. The establishment of a Mexican Inquisition does not come with the conquest of Mexico. It is not until 1571 that we have a formal Mexican inquisitorial tribunal in the New World. An increasingly hostile attitude towards every person suspected of being an old Christian, to having relatives who were processed by the Inquisition occurs, especially during the decade of 1580s and 90s, and then again as we see in the 1630s to 50s. This is a global institution, people. There were treaties of extradition signed between the Portuguese and Spanish Inquisitions. Every dot on this map had a commissary. Some dots on this map had tribunals. It is a global corporate system that communicates among itself. You can be a crypto-Jew processed in Goa, and word of your processing and your relatives will be in danger in Mexico, Lisbon, and Spain. When it arrived into the New World, the Inquisition had already been established for more than 100 years. The region known as New Spain, which included the colonies and the districts of the Atlantic, Guadalajara, Mexico, and Guatemala, this will be the territorial jurisdiction of the Mexican Inquisition. Not the Caribbean, that will later be sent to Cartagena de Indias in Colombia. Understand that this bureaucracy generated vast quantities of written documents relating to every aspect of a tribunal's existence. and it went far beyond just judging and punishing alleged heretics. Medieval and early inquisitions were major forces within their host societies used for political purposes, as we heard, not only locally, regionally, but internationally, with an impact that often went far beyond the strict enforcement of just Catholic belief. But inquisitions were also human institutions, mundane corporate entities, struggling like all bodies to efficiently make and execute policy while staying within a budget. The budget came exclusively from stealing or confiscating goods of those accused. The sophistication of the tribunals of bureaucracy was evident in the extent of its influence, its consistency. One accused Judaizer, given a 3-year sentence in an auto de fe in Spain in 1577, was recorded in later records as having still been observation under surveillance as late as 1589, with spy reports on his activities, his friendships, entered into the tribunal's records long after he was let off with an easy sentence of an abjuración de leve, which is a light sentence of suspicion. Even more insidious was the transatlantic connection of documentation that we saw hinted at in Gretchen's presentation. An amazing bureaucratic feat occurred when a Portuguese Jew, Garcia González Bergamero, in 1579 was brought in because his relatives in the Iberian Peninsula had been brought in on similar charges. Bergamero had immigrated to Mexico in 1559, 20 years earlier. Such cases indicated an extraordinarily detailed level of communication and record keeping, not only within Mexico, but spanning the Atlantic and the Pacific worlds eventually. As they evolved, too, inquisitions developed significant financial roles within local economies. They became one of the largest landowners, one of the largest banking institutions who loaned money to people. There were huge bequests given to it. From any number of historical perspectives, it is well worth examining the process and procedures that occurred in a typical Inquisition trial. That's what I want to give you. I want it so that you can demystify what this institution was and understand when it violated its own laws. There were strict procedures of how cases should be conducted. And in the case of Judaizers, one visiting judge that sanctioned the Mexican Inquisition showed that there is not a single case against Judaizers where proper procedure was followed completely. They violated their own procedure in almost all of the cases in one way or another. This tribunal becomes a system of a multitude of officials, many of them salaried, some of them unsalaried, but given special privileges. A familiar or a qualifier, a consultant, got the jurisdiction, the immunities given to prosecution. Even if you murdered someone, you could not be tried for it. The Inquisition would try you, find you, strip you of your immunity should you be proven to be guilty, and hand you over to secular court. So working without a salary didn't mean you didn't get a benefit. So there was a judicial branch, constables, and a fiscal branch that managed a complex institution. One of the most insidious of all inquisitors in terms of the crypto-Jewish community was this man, Don Alonso de Peralta Robles, senior inquisitor from 1594 to 1609. He spent a little less than basically a decade or so in Mexico, but he tried more Jewish cases than any other inquisitor. He sentenced to death more Jews than all others. What do we know about this man? Out of a total number of 355 completed trials against Judaizers in New Spain from 1571 to 1700, Peralta presided over 172. Under his tenure, he directed 3 out of 10 of the large-scale general autos de fe. In 1601, 124 penitents. In 1610, the one he prepared for, wasn't able to physically visit, another 150. Out of 47 people sentenced to relaxation to be burned at the stake, Peralta condemned 27. So the fate and the character of the judges played a big role in how these institutions did their job. He also spent and created the first changes in the Inquisitorial Palace of Mexico, a palace that was located centrally very close to the main plaza of the city. And it was beautified under his reign. Even when he goes to the Archbishop in Bolivia, he sends money to build new doors and a second story to the palace. So he kept a lifelong interest in the Inquisition here. Now, the official structures for the creation of an Inquisition recognized the distance involved, gave the American tribunals, as it compares to Spain, more power, freedom from action from the Suprema. The only thing they had to get permission on was relaxation to the secular arm, death sentences. And Peralta fought with the Suprema. If it was up to me, would execute it more. So what do we have here? They were instructed to draw up subordinate districts along lines already in use by ecclesiastical and bureaucratic divisions. So there would be commissariats of the Inquisition. And the vast territory that was controlled by New Spain, we're living in a commissariat here. This was once the commissariat of Nuevo Mexico, or las Misiones del Norte de Nuevo Mexico. And it went all the way over to El Paso, actually, with missionary friars receiving titles as commissaries. There is no presence of the Spanish Inquisition except for spies, familiars, until 1626. And it lasts virtually until 1820. The territory of New Mexico will be one of the farthest reaches of the Mexican Tribunal to the north. And the Mexican Tribunal had difficulty incorporating and investigating people in the far north. But they found that the commissariat there was essential. It was well established by 1626 in this region. And New Mexico wasn't just our current state boundaries. It was the entire northland of Mexico. The Rio Colorado eastward to the Great Plains, from the northern frontier of Nueva Vizcaya to the Straits of Ariana. It was huge. And it, similar, had a bureaucratic system. It was a small corporate entity with a local Inquisition commissary who was only an investigating official, with an Inquisition notary, mayor, chief constable, spies, as well as deputy constables in times of crisis. What were the duties of the inquisitorial officials here in New Mexico? They read and publicized Mexican Inquisition's edicts of faith. We're going to see what that is here in a minute. They took denunciations, secret witness testimonies from evidence. They formulated summary inquest proceedings, not trials, to be sent to the Inquisition in Mexico City. They made arrests and sequestrations of grave cases. If they feared someone would escape the territory before the Inquisitors responded, they had the power to arrest them under local arrest. And after initial review, they sent their cases for qualification in Mexico. They are extremely powerful personages in the colony of Mexico, and they almost always were Franciscan friars, later a few Jesuits. We have these people, and they are powerful enough to bring down governors, as we're going to hear tomorrow. Just one example of how this corporate entity worked in just a decade or so. From Fray José Antonio Guerrero, Inquisition commissary, worked for Fray Diego Arias Espinosa, the notary. The alguacil mayor was Don Juan Antonio Pérez Velar, a secular member of rancher. And there were numerous familiars and deputy constables for various arrests. So the presence of an official of the Inquisition here in New Mexico gave the clergy a powerful weapon to use in disagreements with hostile secular authorities, particularly governors, as we will see. The Jewish community, crypto-Jews, and converso communities that migrated further north or further south were those that were trying to escape the active cognizance and surveillance of the Inquisition. Several cases exist in which the local commissaries arrested, tried governors of the province. We're going to hear about one of these cases tomorrow. But they also arrested soldiers, many of which who had apparently continued to practice Judaism or some aspects, cultural aspects, of what the Catholic Church thought was the Jewish understanding or culture. How does an Inquisition work? We all hear about trials. What is a trial? How did it work? And how did crypto-accused Judaizers, how were they persecuted and prosecuted? It's important to go back to some of the earliest historians. Henry Charles Lee, himself burdened by his own Protestant interpretations, said that in considering the judicial functions of the Inquisition, we shall meet with much that is abhorrent to our conceptions of justice. We shall see that the accused was assumed to be guilty, that the object of the tribunal was to induce or coerce them to confess the guilt, and that for this purpose he was substantially deprived of facilities for his defense, and that the result, for the most part, depended on his powers of endurance, which the judges at their discretion would test to the utmost. Inquisitors themselves, and Francisco Peña, who was in Rome, a Spaniard who was annotating one of the first inquisitorial manuals, wrote, "We must remember," in a footnote, "that the main purpose of the trial and execution is not to save the soul of the accused, but to achieve the public good and put fear into others." What is an edict of faith? This is how all trials began. People did not know exactly, many of them were poorly trained in their own Christianity, not even the conversos. Native-born old Christians had very little understanding of theology. So an Edict of Faith was a didactic document that told you what was good and what was bad, what you had to report. An Inquisition case could begin of one of three ways. A formal accusation. This is under accusatorial law. That means I accuse Pedro Perez of being a Jew. You become party to the case. You are the accuser against the defendant. That meant if you are not proven true, you go to jail for lying, for false testimony. This is rare, very rare, because you put your neck on the line. What you could do instead is create a denunciation. I heard it true, or it has been observed that they eat pork, or they don't eat pork, or they clean their houses on Fridays. So you make a denunciation of a fact, a piece of evidence, instead of an accusation. There, you are not liable. Then the inquisitorial judge becomes fact finder with the denunciation. Or an inquisitor, and in some cases a commissary, has the power to launch an Inquisition, an inquiry into what's going on about certain people or group of people. Anyone, the edict said, who have seen, witnessed acts of heresy, who have personally should come before us, the inquisitors, in our audience chamber, to declare and manifest anything that they may have known, have seen, did, or done, touching upon our holy Catholic faith and this holy office. One whole section of all the general edicts talks about the laws of Moses. What are the laws of Moses? What are its cultural practices? Very little about belief is contained in the edicts of faith. These are cultural practices that you must pay attention to. One list of signs included very vague things. Changing into clean personal linen on Saturdays. Wearing better clothes than on other days. Preparing on Fridays the food for Saturdays. In stewing pans on a small fire. Or those who do not work on Friday evenings and Saturdays as on other days. Who kindle lights and clean lamps with new wicks on Friday evenings. Who place clean linen on the beds and clean napkins on the table. Who celebrate the festival of the unleavened bread, eat unleavened bread and celery and bitter herbs. Who do not wish to eat salt pork, hares, rabbits, snails, fish, and the list grew on and on. Who bathe the bodies of their dead. If any known person that in any house people congregate for the purpose of carrying on religious services, or read out of Bibles in the vernacular, or perform other Judaic ceremonies, they should be denounced. Edict of Faith in New Spain, 1632. So you have a denunciation. What happens? Any one of those three processes leads you to the creation of a document called a summario, a summary, which is a list of how many people are denouncing this act. If you, in your denunciation, say, me and Juan Gonzalez were watching, we were gambling, we saw them do these strange things, the Inquisition will summon, by edicto citatorio, Juan Gonzalez, force him to give testimony. When they had at least 2 testimonies, they could begin a summary case. The summary case itself would have to be given over to a very important but misunderstood official, the qualifier. And here is where the Jewish communities and converso communities in New Spain had a secret ally. Many of the second and third sons of these families of conversos went into the clergy. There are quite a few who became qualifiers. Without a qualifier signature saying there is heresy here, no trial could occur. They could stop the trial of their relatives or their friends and associates at this stage. That's something that very few people realize. The theological qualifiers could do one of 2 things. They could say, yes, the case has merit, and they do a calificación, qualification, a document that's added to the summary. If there is no evidence, they believe there's not enough evidence, they stop that case right where it is. And they tell the inquisitors, you must suspend it until we have more evidence. From the qualification of the case, how do you get to an arrest warrant? Well, you don't, unless it's qualified. So the qualification takes you to several options. There are 3 options the inquisitors will have. What do they do when they receive a theological qualification? They can absolutely agree that the testimony is sufficient. The qualification says we should make an arrest warrant. Then they can generate an arrest warrant. If they're unsure, they will suspend or hold the case until they get more evidence. But they have to resubmit the summary and the qualification back to the qualifier when they get more evidence. So it can be stopped again at that stage. Or they are required by the qualifiers to stop the case there because there's not enough evidence. They could completely release the memory of the person or just warehouse it until someone else. They keep these records forever. You were denounced at 22 for Judas practices. When you're 70 years old, someone accuses you again, they're going to pull out the record of your 24-year-old case and they're going to add evidence to it. From issuing an arrest warrant to the imprisonment, and here's where they make their money. The arrest warrant led to the chief constable, alguacil mayor, to arrest the suspect. This is a secular official who was commissioned by the Inquisition and received a salary. Now that person goes with the arrest warrant. The person who's about to be arrested does not know they're even being investigated. It is a completely secret inquest. So many people don't know. They're going to arrest the actual suspect. They're going to also make an inventory of all their property they encountered at the moment they encountered them. A huge list. They take a notary with them. And then they confiscate any movable goods, monies, furniture, anything that could be of value. And that is taken in an ox cart, if you're in New Mexico, all the way to Mexico City. And you're going to read and hear about what happened to one of your governors here in the past. From issuing an arrest warrant to imprisonment, the prisoner, and he gets his personal belongings. If you are rich and wealthy, you can have a huge bed brought to your prison cell. You can have slaves brought with you. There is no limit. You can eat whatever you want in an inquisitorial prison, but you pay for it. It comes out of your own money. Okay? If you are poor and have no money, the Inquisition will pay for your maintenance. But those trials are finished very quickly. The chief constable then goes to the prison. The jailer, who receives a fee for all of this, the jailer will receive the prisoner and find him a space in the secret prisons. Why are they secret? Because during the inquest phase, until you are charged, you can have no contact with anyone in the outside world. So you have to be secretly hidden away, even from other prisoners. Once the accused is in prison, wrote the Compilación de las Instrucciones de Santo Oficio, the constable should place him in where no one else can see him, talk to him, or give him any news, either in writing or in word of mouth. And he should not let prisoners communicate with one another, except when the inquisitors have advised him that the communication between them should not result in any inconveniences. When you got put into a cell with another prisoner, you should be very frightened, because that prisoner is there to inform on you. They only allow prisoners to speak, and they take records of what they were talking about. So it is a way to send a spy in among your midst. There were many prisons, secret prisons, penitential prisons, perpetual prisons. If you were cooperative, you could move from the secret prisons, which were usually nasty dungeon-like places, to ones that have maybe a high ceiling window where air can get in. The fiscal or money aspect of this is what the crypto-Jewish community did. It was incredibly growing. The conversions were getting wealthy through mercantile, as we heard. They were connected to the slave trade in South America, to many of the importation of European goods trades in New Spain. So what happens? The notary of sequestered goods takes the inventory and updates it with any new things. If someone owed you money, that person now becomes a debtor of the Inquisition. The Inquisition always got paid. Okay? So your debts then became the debts of the Inquisition. The inventory, the goods, are given to two officials. The notary of the sequestered goods receives it. He drew up these two inventories. He keeps all the liquid cash. All the furniture and movable goods are sold at auction, turned into money, and that is given to the receiver, the receptor. Now the receptor receives these things, and he, with the accountant, make an account in the account books under the name of the prisoner, and they put into the strong boxes the monies from the sales of their goods. It could be a lot, it could be a little. Judaizers, conversos, secret Jews, and people who were completely innocent of Judaizing all understood that they were paying for their cases and everything that happened. Every time they saw someone, that was a fee that came out of their goods. Don Tomás Trevino de Sobremonte even joked about it in his death sentence. In the auto de fe of 1649, Trevino was burned alive, even though there was a letter in Spain from the Suprema to the Mexican inquisitors telling them to act with mercy since his family was friendly and were loaning money to the royal court. They ignored it. He was sentenced to be burned at the stake. He's said to have sarcastically, reportedly, have scorned them, even as they were piling wood on. He said, "Throw some more wood on my fire. I'm paying enough for this." The last moment there is resistance from these people. Imprisonment to the hearing. This is where violations occur in Jewish cases, mostly. It should be 8 days, dictated by structure at most. Some people go 6 years without having a first audience in their prison cells. After being imprisoned for at least 8 days, the law says you have to come before the inquisitors. So the jailer will bring you before the tribunal. And this will be the first time you come face to face to your persecutors, who are there not as impartial judges weighing evidence, but fact-finding judges who are there inquisitorial law to prosecute you. As you come before the tribunal, the inquisitors start asking you simple questions, but everything is used against you. The initial hearing requires you to do your genealogy for them. Give them details about your life. Tell us about the substance of the information. They give no names of witnesses. They say, someone said that you don't like pork, or that you clean and light candles on Fridays. And you have to explain away various charges. And when he was asked for an account of his life, the inquisitors did in one case, he's going to ask to declare where he was born, raised, where he lived and resided, with whom he treated, and had common communication. All of this was asked to give in great detail with particular care. To be Portuguese, as we hear, the mere fact you say you were born in Portugal, that's evidence against you. Have you been in Germany or in the Netherlands? Evidence against you. Almost all information available on possible Jewish settlement in Mexico during the colonial period is based on inquisitorial documents. The investigators took great care to record every piece of testimony, including migration patterns of families and other peoples. Every bit of evidence could be extracted from someone suspectedly or secretly practicing Jewish rites was of the utmost importance for the gathering of the names of others and to extirpate what they thought was traces of a Jewish culture being practiced in Mexico. So the genealogy, disclose the names of your relatives, acquaintances. Were they tried by an inquisition before? Once you tell them where they're from, you can lie and say no. They're going to send a document to Spain or to Portugal and ask, on the list of your process, do you have this person? And it will take years for them sometimes to hear back. You'll be rotting in prison until they find the evidence they want. The surviving files contain precise descriptions of traditions and practices that provide invaluable opportunity to understand the world of these new Christians in Mexico. Here's where the lack of defense comes in. At this point in the trial, regardless of what you had told them or if you told them nothing, the prosecutor gets involved, the fiscal, inquisidor fiscal. He is going to consult the transcripts of the first audience and all of the documentation before. In that consultation, he will prepare a list of charges. And these charges will become the formal accusation against the person. Charges that more information and proof will be gathered on. The formal accusation is read before the defendant in the tribunal room. And at the moment they're reading the charges, you have to respond one by one without a lawyer to defend you. So the poor prisoner is brought back by the jailer to the tribunal, where he will meet the inquisitors and, for the first time, the prosecuting attorney. The prosecuting attorney will present the evidence in the case, and they always ask for the death penalty, always, regardless of whether it was even legally possible. And they describe it as a legal tactic to strike horror in the defendant to make them confess. The goal is the confession. They are allowed to lie, cheat, make up evidence, as long as it gets you to confess. So at this point, they ask for the death sentence, even if the law wouldn't permit it. So, what do you have then? The formal accusation is read to the prisoner. The prisoner, without the defense attorney, has to respond to every charge one by one. They created documents which is called response to the charges. That document is line by line. To charge 1, I deny it. To charge 2, I deny it. To charge 3, that wasn't what I said. And it goes on and on and on. But all of that is evidence. The Protestant anti-polemicist, anti-Catholic polemicist said, a prisoner in the Inquisition, John Fox, is never allowed to see the face of his accuser or the witnesses against him, but by every method is taken by threats and tortures to oblige him to confess and accuse himself, and by that means to corroborate their evidence. Only after you have responded do you get to have an attorney, when it's too late. It's already too late by the time you responded. The defense attorney now comes in to have a consultation once you have conducted your charge. Though the inquisitor might give him, wrote one prisoner to another, told him in a secret conversation, an advocate, he'd give him no one good, but a fellow who would only do what the inquisitor wanted. And if by chance asked for an advocate or solicitor not of the Inquisition, they wouldn't serve. For if they went contrary to the inquisitor's wishes, they would get up some charge of false belief, want of respect, and cast them into the prison. That happened on several occasions in the early period. Your only strategies, then, were to work with your lawyer to do one of three things. You can attack, as we heard in one case, with your defense attorney, you can attack the witnesses against you. The attorney was limited by legal reasons. The attorney couldn't practice his art. The art of being an attorney in early modern Iberia was to delay the cases, was to constantly ask for stays, for extended periods of evidence gathering. None of that was allowed. Those legal tactics were forbidden to attorneys. And the moment they actually find out that their defendant is guilty, they have to confess it and stop their defense. So the moment they find out any inkling, or they themselves feel that the person's guilty, it's over. What defense did exist meant getting rid of prosecution witnesses by what's called tachas. Strike them for animosity, but you had to prove it. Then there is character witnesses, which is a dangerous proposition. If you bring in character witnesses here, you're a good Christian, and you are actually convicted, your character witnesses will become suspicious, and many of them will be tried for lying, it's perjury. And finally, this happened in rare occasions, but it did happen in the 1630s and 40s. Recusation, removal of an inquisitor for animosity against you. And this ends up creating a visitation of the Mexican Inquisition by a special judge, because there were so many abuses. This is where torture comes in. There is no torture until the phase of accusation and the presentation of a defense. Once you have not confessed, and most people don't confess until this stage, you now enter the judicial. Once the accusation comes, you're in a judicial trial. Up until the accusation, it's an inquest. It's not a trial. So once the accusation comes, now this is juridical procedure you have to go through. There are only 3 permissible tortures that could be used. It doesn't mean they don't violate this, but legally they could only use 3 types. And the first time, they could take you to a torture chamber that wasn't even the torture chamber. They could show you axes and knives and machines of torture that they cannot legally use. It is to strike fear again, so that it's called in conspectum tormentaro, in the prospect of the torment. And many people confess right there. If you don't, then you are taken to one of 3 torments. You could be given the garrucha, which is the strapping pulley called the strappado in Italian, or the torture of the cords, which was literally lying on a rack or on a slab and tying tourniquets to all the fleshy parts of your body. Torture of the cords of the mother of Mariana was really sad. In 1595, Doña Francisca de Carvajal, mother of Mariana, was accused of evidence of her crypto-Judaism being not eating pork, changing her linen, and having taught her daughters. The trial transcripts reported in intimate detail her ordeal. She was ordered, as the transcript says, to be placed on the potro, on the rack. She said, "Señores, why will you not tell me what I have to say? Señor, put me down. I said I did it all." She was told not to lie and to perjure, but to tell it again. She said, "I do not remember, señores. Take me away. I did what all the witnesses say." She was told to tell it again in detail. "Señor, as I have told you, I do not know for certain. I cannot remember. I've said that I did all that the witnesses say. Release me for the love of God. I do not remember it." The worst, and continually to the present day, the most effective torture for those who torment people is waterboarding, that toca. The toca was probably the most effective. Although the strappado was called the queen of torments by many scholars, it's the water torture where most people broke. And this is gradual asphyxiation with small quantities of water. The toca was the linen hood they put on your head and poured water over it. It was brutal. In some cases, the prisoner received 6 or more jars of water. And this is terrible. The water torture of one person, a accused crypto-Jew, Rico Franco Tavares, in February of 1601 by Don Alonso de Peralta, basically describes the order of the torture. After having survived the rack and the twisting of the cords for 6 times, they waterboarded him with 6 jars of water. Most people with ounces break. he withstood 6 jars of water. During 6 turns of the cords, he had cried out, "My God, my God, my God, I've already told you the truth. On my death I swear it. I did not believe in the laws of Moses." Then, according to the transcripts, the executioner placed the linen hood over his head, poured large jars of water down him. Once they forced a quarter of the first jar, they pulled him up and asked him, "I have already said it, and that is all that I will say. This is the account that I will give to God." The executioner proceeded to remove the hood after 6 more jars had poured, and he did not respond. He was taken back to the prison. It took 2 hours as torture. He would not confess. He would be sentenced to death as an impenitent, recalcitrant Judaizer. His imprisonment, Rodrigo Tavares saw all kinds of abuses in the process. The total number of Judaizing cases in the Mexican Inquisition was 355, 24 of which saw the legal use of torture, 6.8%. Not very often, but when it was used, the abuses were rife. Once you've gotten a confession through torture, or they have resisted a confession, you go to the sentencing, to the verdict. They call it the auto de votos. They make their votes. And you have civil judges who are consultants of the Inquisition who will weigh in. You have a representative of the bishop. The civil judges ask for people to be tortured again, even though it's a violation. They always ask, wasn't tortured well enough? Should be tortured more. Always the civil judges want death. But if the inquisitors in the ordinary were in unity, they could issue a death sentence. If the ordinary declined to allow a death sentence, they couldn't pass the death sentence. It had to be a lesser sentence. The types of sentences given, 67% of the cases are getting off on a light suspicion. Only 1% were actually relaxed in person, but those are horrifying cases. All of them contain many abuses of law, procedure, and corruption. The symbol of the San Benito was the symbol of pride. Some of them remarked that they were a symbol of their resistance to being persecuted. Others looked upon it as a garment of shame. Saco bendito. This is what you wore as a symbol of public humility. There are a few places on earth where you can still see what the ones that hung churches look like. In the Archbishop of the Diocese of Tuy in Spain, this is the one for Andrés Duarte Coronado. Vecino de Tuy, ausente y escaped. Judaizante, reconciliado, and then relajado in a estatua, in effigy. Because he was smart enough to get out of town after he got off his first case. As Gretchen said, 3 strikes are out, 2 strikes are out. It depended on the weight of the evidence. But you could be marched in an Operación Leve with a San Benito that was just white or yellow or black, depending on the tribunal. If there was some suspicion proved against you, you would wear a 1 stripe. The Mexican Inquisition had a media asta. 2 stripes without anything. If you're going to get a formally being accused but you're repentant. If you are going to be reconciled because you've confessed, you'll have flames turned upside down. Right? Like this one. Or if you were going to be burned, you had flames and demons and devils put upon your San Benito. Many a victim of inquisitorial investigations frequently conducted under torture admitted at least part of the charges. It's important to note that not all suspected or convicted Judaizers actually practiced any Jewish rites at all. Some of them had no connection whatsoever with the Jewish people and were innocent victims of denunciation and political manipulation and greed and corruption. Other victims considered themselves to be Jewish, even if their rites were not actually within the accepted Judaic practice or any type of belief. As Doña Mariana said, what is wrong? What is best, to believe what you don't believe or not to believe what you believe? So the question of belief for some of these is through a Christian lens of belief, as we've already seen. In total, about 1,500 persons were accused of Judaizing during the 16th and 17th centuries. More than 100 were executed in public in effigy or in person. Some 200 died in prison. More died during the process than the executions. On the other hand, it seems the Inquisition never reached a number of people who were really practicing Jews in provinces in the far north. Typical accusations that did merit sentences included observations of the Sabbath, which include things such as wearing clean clothes on Saturdays, eating meat on Fridays, paying visits to friends, refusal to eat pork, showing some traces of the ritual slaughter or preparation of food, or abstaining from specific meals. Anti-Catholic provocations were the most salacious, like blood libel, right? Absence from Mass, working on Sundays, or compelling servants to work on Catholic Sundays. Lots of people's servants denounced them because they were forced to work on Sundays. Acts of hatred towards Christianity, such as beating crucifixes, stamping on them, blasphemies against saints. These are all there. In the New World Inquisition's total numbers of trials, now there are thousands of testimonies, tens of thousands of denunciations, maybe 30,000 summaries of trials, but in Mexico, only 2,400 trials in the 300 years. 2,200 in Lima, and roughly from what we can reconstruct from Cartagena, about 1,100. Of those, up to 1,700, only 47 were sentenced to death in Mexico, but with the exception of 4 people, they were all Judaizers. How did the Inquisition violate its procedures in these cases? It's important to look at the case of Maria Núñez de Carvajal and several others. The visiting judges from the Suprema found incredible violations of procedure. Writing to the Suprema, the visiting judge Pedro de Medina Rico in 1646 wrote, "I certify and give my word that I saw and examined the lawsuits and trials of faith pursued by the Inquisition in the said city of Mexico against various persons and criminals and prisoners held in secret prisons and in others. And almost all of the trials that have serious errors or lack of proper procedures were for the followers of the law of Moses. And in these, there were few acquittals or suspended sentences, and few other convicts reconciled or released. And there are so many other lawsuits yet to be concluded. In all of these trials, I observed some defects," he wrote, "in each lawsuit, which I put forth in the form of a warning, written into the records of the criminals, so that the defects may be declared, and said fault should be evident, so that they, the said inquisitors, should reform their procedures, and many other abuses. 2 of the inquisitors in the great purges of the 1640s will be removed, and find themselves in trouble with their own institution. Even in death, you could not escape if you were an accused Judaizer. The case of Doña María de Rivera, tried as a Jew in New Spain, she starved herself in prison to escape the torments. She entered the prison on the 16th of May, 1642. A hearing at her own request was held in May of the same year. She was repentant. The first hearing in which they asked her about her genealogy was given the 27th of May, quickly. On the 16th of November, 1643, Maria died at dawn in her cell. Her cellmate, Doña Margarita de Moira, declared that the day before the criminal was sick and complained of feeling ill. The jailer was aware of her condition, but just left her there in the cell. He would be sanctioned by the Holy Office removed from his position. That night, she died. According to the visiting judges who investigated corruption and wrongdoing in the case, the fault of the jailer Marañón was in not notifying anyone of her illness. There was a doctor on staff. According to all of this, Doña Maria had feared that false testimony, according to her cellmate, had been whipped up, that she herself had whipped a figure of the Christ child, and that was going to be used against her. It was a lie, proven in the trial to be not true. In another declaration, Margarita Morena, the cellmate who survived and gave evidence about their discussions in prison, said that she had a great hatred of the inquisitors. They ordered the surgeons to dig up her body, examine it, perform a rude autopsy. They opened it and declared that she had died of starvation. The surgeons attributed her behavior to desperation. They tried her memory. A second trial against her memory was conducted. An impenitent for despairing of the mercy of God and letting herself die of hunger. The prosecutor presented the denunciation, asked that her mother and sisters be notified so they could defend her honor. Why would you do that? Because she's going to lose all her worldly goods. Her children will get nothing. If they defend and prove her innocent, her goods would not be completely sacrificed, only half. The testimony of 52 witnesses was given in publication of the evidence. None appeared at the trial. They decided to release her memory. There was no order to exhume her bones or any effort made on her behalf since she died in prison. The visiting judge, there's no record of it, and it was a sin to open the body. This, we're talking about 1600 here. This is not allowable. And it wasn't the surgeon that did it, it was the executioner. So this was a violation of the total protocol and of Christianity. Long imprisonments and delays in cases against Judaizers were particularly heinous. Pedro de la Huerta, tried as a Jew in acts of offense against the Holy Office, had only one witness in the case, should not have been arrested in the first place. The prisoner entered the prisons on the 13th of July, 1642, didn't have his hearing until the 3rd of August, 1644, his first hearing. 2 years in prison without meeting the inquisitors. Other cases, like Pedro Espinosa, 3 years before his first audience. All of these violations of procedure. Then we have people who discover their Jewish connection while in prison. Luis de Carvajal el Mozo, fascinating character. He circumcises himself for the covenant in prison. The drive to become an observant Jew can be clearly seen in cases like this. He wrote later and was dictated to someone else. Prompted by the Almighty and his good angel, I left the corridor of the house where I had been reading, leaving behind the sacred Bible, not the Torah, but the Christian Bible, took some old worn scissors and went over to the ravine of the Paluco River. There, with longing and a vivid wish to be inscribed in the book of the living, something that could not happen without this holy sacrament, I sealed it by cutting off almost all of the prepuce, leaving very little of it. Padre Contreras, the priest who walked with Luis de Carvajal to his stake, told the inquisitors in the post-execution confession, because all of the people who walked with the condemned were giving testimony after the auto de fe. He was always such a good Jew, and he reconciled his understanding, which was very profound and sensitive, with his highly inspired divine determination to defend the law of God, the Mosaic, and to fight for it. I have no doubt that if he had lived before the incarnation of our Redeemer, he would have been a heroic Hebrew, and his name would have been as famous in the Bible as are the names of those who died in the defense of their law when it was necessary. Even the friars saw that this was someone who truly had belief, but they framed it the Catholic understanding of belief. Our belligerent Thomas Trevino Sobremonte was probably the leader of at least one of 3 large Jewish communities at the time in mid-17th century Mexico. Began his adventurous life escaping Spain under an assumed name, where his mother had later been martyred, had been tried and processed and executed. Water and fire. We conclude that it is through these 2, both accepting, purifying, and punishing sources or elements of life, that New Spain's crypto-Jews faced prosecution and persecution at the hands of the inquisitors. With that, we have traced at least the beginning understanding.
I'll take questions.
Thank you for such a vivid understanding of what actually took place. What was the process by which they decided the actual process of the trials? I mean, who decided that, and how was it a committee? Was it one person? How long did it take to?
This is the Roman legal system adapted to canon law. So what inquisitorial law really is, corpus juris inquisitionis, develops over time. It begins probably in the 13th century, some of the first attempts at creating instructions or manuals of itinerant inquisitors, people who receive episcopal and papal power to go around investigating acts of heresy, acts of false belief or improper belief. These come together with collections of papal bulls that instruct what is heresy, defines heresy, to the Spanish case, even regulations dictated, cartas acordadas, letters sent by the Supreme Council of the Inquisition on judicial affairs, like how should the San Benitos be made, or how should the procedures of the auto de fe be standardized. There are legal decisions by the inquisitors. The counselors of the Council of the Inquisition, La Suprema, are creating in process as they develop. This institution grows from a series of one inquisitor and one notary to that whole massive bureaucracy that we see. It is a gradual additive process based in canon law and in the Spanish, specifically the Spanish New World version, on imperial council rulings. So it is a legal system that develops, and they're still making rulings until 1821. In Spain till 1834. So this is a legal system that adapts Roman law. Juridical torture was used by everyone. And this is where the Inquisition, you have to look at it, comparing the civil courts. The civil courts use torture in all cases. The Inquisition could only use it in cases of true heresy. Witches were not tortured. That's considered a superstition, not a heresy. So it's not doctrinal heresy. So there are cases that would never warrant torture. If you look at that chart of torture, it is Protestants that actually receive far more tortures. Almost 30% of all Protestants accused are tortured. Only 6.8% of Jews in Mexico. It was a political tool of the Spanish imperial system to root out foreigners, especially Dutch and English pirates. Many of these people tortured were basically renegade pirates that were caught. And they're tried both civil court and inquisitorial court. Some of them desecrated images, Catholic images. When you look at cases that solve torture, cases against priests who solicit sex and confessional, they got the clerical benefit of not being able to be tortured. That's one of the benefits of the clergy. But there are clergy who are tortured. Where? When they were accused of Judaizing. So even their protections that were legally supposed to protect them from torture, saw them tortured. So this Inquisition, this tribunal could not resist violating its own procedures in the case of Judaizers, which is very interesting. So if we look at that chart, I'll put that up as we answer the other question.
I was going to ask you actually about that chart. I noticed quickly it said Protestant, because you only had it up for a second.
Yeah, that is Lutherans and Calvinists.
Yeah, could you put that up? I
Yeah,
thought it
sure.
was interesting just to look at it and comment on it. Sure.
This is based from the beginning of the Mexican Inquisition until 1700. Records are spotty. A lot of the Inquisition records, 1700 later, were taken out of the Inquisition and sold to U.S. libraries and other. So we have the best records, really, for this time period. So this is all of the cases. Alumbrados, people who had revelations. We talked about alumbrados. Judaizers, there were 355 cases, more cases against Jews than any other. Superstitions, which included witchcraft, but also things like what we would consider superstitious beliefs. Crimes against the Holy Office, that's disobeying the Holy Office, destroying its property, talking bad about inquisitors, faking a San Benito. Heretical propositions, I don't believe the Virgin was a virgin. That's the kind of heretical proposition. Or fornication is not a sin. Various other crimes lumped together. Bigamy, remind you that after the Council of Trent, the sacrament of matrimony is better defined. And double matrimony is a heresy, because the sacrament, it's a sacrament. You're heretically violating the sacrament of matrimony. Muslim practices, there are two cases of Muslim practices in the New World of slaves who are practicing a type of Islam, and solicitation of sex and confession. Slaves were rarely tortured. Slaves often gave testimony against their masters and many times blasphemed to get out of being punished. So they're being whipped and they would scream out, "Cago en la hostia!" I take defecate on the holy wafer. If the master continues to punish them, the master, having heard a blasphemy, not denouncing it, could be denounced. And the master knew the slave would denounce him if he didn't stop. And there are cases where he continued to whip them immediately. The slave went to a commissary or to the inquisitor and said, "My master beat me even though I said I was shitting on the holy wafer." So this is the kind of way that it could be used in denunciation by various sectors of society.
I had a question, a very quick
Yeah.
question about it. We know where almost all of these archives are. We know all. The one that's missing is Cartagena. And
It was burned completely.
I'm sorry.
It was burned.
There are no copies.
Yes, we have stuff in the Archivo Histórico Nacional in Madrid that are summaries of autos de fe, summaries of contentious cases. Cases where there's some legal issue, they had to send it back to decide upon.
That's the one that genealogists really want to get their hands on. And the stuff that was copied is not really what we really need. So
I have seen in Cartagena de Indias, I've been there several times, in a private house. What happened is at the destruction, the extinction of the Tribunal of Cartagena, many families, many of the mercantile families that had relatives who were tried, they went in and they threw out the windows, the entire archive. But some people picked things up and took them home. I know of at least two families, wealthy families in Cartagena that have documents that their relatives got. There's transcripts that are in the Archivo Histórico Nacional. I think I have most of that digitized, so if you're interested, I can get you that stuff.
We're going to do one more question.
Yeah, I'd like to refer to a specific case that you had on your chart there of Francisco Gomez Robledo. From what I've read from Kessel, Hortus, and others, there seems to be an abundance of evidence that he and his father were practicing Judaism, and he spent 3 years in Mexico City.
Yeah.
Yet he was exonerated. Do you have any indication, or have you come across any document that suggests why he was exonerated?
We get into the questions of corruption and questions of scrutiny of evidence. As the 18th century and the late 17th century occurs, inquisitors become incredulous. Witchcraft, for example. The inquisitors in their debates and many of their rulings don't believe in witchcraft. So they have actually imbibed by the 18th century some of these Enlightenment ideals, and they're debating the weight of evidence. They also look at the quality of the witness testimonies. Who is the person? La calidad de la persona que da testimonio. The quality of that person. If it's a slave, if it's someone who's a debtor, or if it's someone who might be a lower class or status, it doesn't hold the same weight as una persona de calidad, quality person. A lot of it has to do, you can have 100 witnesses of low quality and 4 of higher quality, and the 4 of higher quality will have more weight. But in that case there, I believe there was some allegations of corruption. These inquisitors not only took bribes, but they forced bribes. You could be taken out of the secret prisons for money and be put into penitential prisons where you can have visitors. You could have your spouse come and live in the prison with you. And even when you were sentenced to perpetual imprisonment, you could come in and out, go out, work, and come back in, as if it was a neighborhood. So it was the Patio de las Naranjas, the palace of the Mexican Inquisition prisons, was kind of like a neighborhood, a body. And people, the wives and children came in and out, and sometimes the accused would come in and out. Other times they worked in the prison for their maintenance, because their money had run out long before. So a lot of corruption occurred, especially people well-connected. What is the best question to ask is why certain people were convicted when they had equal or less evidence. And that has a lot to do with the quality of the person and their wealth. Because it does, as Stanley Horty said, it's an economic institution that has to pay salaries of an increasing bureaucracy. It has assumptions. When they seized the palace of the Inquisition in Mexico City, there were movable goods in the value of 6 million pesos. There were tapestries and art. There were silver and gilded things. An inventory was taken. I published a book in 2012, Johns Hopkins Press, called The Inquisition in Spain. I just took several of these inventories. You can see what the wealth was in the inside of this palace. Most people owed money to it. It held more mortgage deeds on properties and loans than any other institution outside of the church itself, the archbishopric. So the archbishopric and the Inquisition, 2 largest landowners by default. People defaulted on their loans. By bequests, people gave money. So we're talking about institutions that operated in a financial interest way. And these are the best high-profile cases where corruption could occur. Many of the corruptions that these people got off on occurred in Spain because of their connections to court and to the Suprema. There are counselors in the Suprema that will have taken bribes for some people who were tried in Peru and Cartagena and Mexico. So the key to a lot of these cases is examining the evidence of political connections and accusations against inquisitors. A lot of people only look at the trials of the people who are being tried. They don't look at the correspondence of the inquisitors to the Suprema, of the Suprema to the inquisitors, or denunciations against the inquisitors in Spain. Because there are people denouncing these various cases. So you need to look at, understand the way the process is to see what kind of documents might be there to help these kind of cases and questions that are left behind. And there are a lot of these things that still need to be researched in deeper level. But there are answers there. And you've used that case. Have you used it? You've written on that case?
Pardon me?
Have you written on that case?
No, I'm descended from us.
Oh, wow. Does your family have any documentation?
And I've been working through my genealogy research to try to document everything rather than just depend on Ancestry.com or something
Sure.
like that. Yeah, I was very intrigued by the fact that he was in prison that long. Much of his property was confiscated, and again, there seemed to be not irrefutable evidence, but there seemed to be a number of witnesses.
So you have his case, the transcript of his case?
Yes.
Okay. Fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you, John.